It's taken a little bit longer than I meant it to film the final part of this video, but finally here we are. Before I start to look at Darcy's family tree, which is the main part of this video really, I thought I'd begin with something a bit more casual, a bit lighter, that is mentioned in chapter 44 of the novel, because it's really quite interesting. It tells us something about what is effectively Darcy's equivalent of a car. Elizabeth has come to visit Derbyshire with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. She meets Darcy at Pemberley when she's visiting, and he promises to introduce his sister at some point, and as soon as his sister Georgiana arrives, he does take her to meet Elizabeth at the inn where she's staying. But it's said that they drive to the inn in a curricle, which is basically a light carriage for two people, just a driver and a passenger on the same seat. There's no extra space for a coachman or anything like that. So it is literally one person driving, one person sitting next to them. That's quite an informal way of travelling. I think it tells us something about Darcy as a character. That's not something I'm going to necessarily get into too deeply here, because other people have done other things about that in a more literary sense. I'm concentrating here more on social history, but it does sound like quite an easy way to show that he's doing something quite informal. He's not going around in a grand carriage with all these servants and footmen and coachmen just to visit Elizabeth in the inn. Basically, he's taking his little sister out for a spin. It's quite a young man thing to do. And ironically, it does give Darcy something in common with another young man in one of Jane Austen's novels. That young man is his complete opposite. Just as Wickham paints Darcy in a bad light in Pride and Prejudice to try and get Lizzie on his side, in chapter 9 of Sense and Sensibility, Willoughby, who is arguably just as morally suspect as Wickham, tries to justify his dislike of Colonel Brandon with three very flimsy reasons, and one being that Colonel Brandon has found fault with the hanging of his curricle, Willoughby's curricle. I think it would be the equivalent of saying the suspension in your car is not very good. So it's basically a bit unbalanced, and it's going to make for a very bumpy ride. Willoughby is quite a racy character. He's a bit show-offy, not a man to necessarily be trusted. He's quite reckless in that regard. He doesn't look after his curricle. Darcy, on the other hand, treats his with a little more respect. The novel tells us that it features livery, which in other words is just the Darcy family's heraldic badge. Some people call it coat of arms. Apparently that is not, strictly speaking, the correct name for it. Strictly speaking, it's a heraldic badge. Between 1793 and 1882, so exactly when the book is set, right at the beginning of that period, if you want to have livery on your carriage, if you're able to afford a carriage, you had to pay a tax of 2 guineas. A guinea was £1 and a shilling. It doesn't sound like a lot of money. I suppose the modern equivalent of putting your livery on your carriage or curricle or your vehicle of choice in the Regency period would be a personalised registration plate. Get a particularly sought after one and they can go for quite a lot of money. Road tax, on the other hand, is about £155 from the second year of owning the vehicle today. I wouldn't really say that having the livery is comparable to just plain road tax. It's a far bigger expense than that. So not only does Darcy have enough money to keep a carriage and horses and stable and feed and shoe them, it's the same equivalent of maintaining a car today. He most certainly would be employing and probably housing and feeding his grooms and his stable hands and his coachmen. He can also afford to pay the equivalent of £2,000 to have his family heraldry painted on the side of his vehicle. He's really, really rich. And just as with cars today, most families in the novel do seem to have at least one carriage. The Bennets have only got one, and there's 7 in that family, so theirs must have been the equivalent of a people carrier. Mr. Collins boasts that his patroness, Lady Catherine, has several carriages, and when she visits Longbourn to bully Elizabeth, basically, there is no nicer word for it, she is a bully, and she's basically bullying Elizabeth into compliance, or not, and as the case turns out, into promising that she won't marry Darcy. She chooses to travel in a chaise and four. Bingley definitely also seems to have some unspecified type of carriage, but again, before he rents Netherfield, he comes down to visit the place in what Mrs. Bennet described as a chaise and four. Now, a chaise is a light carriage, closed in to protect you from the elements, so it has got a body as such. The early ones could only hold 2 passengers at the most, and would be drawn by 1 or 2 horses because it was more economical. I suppose running one carriage with 4 horses over a long distance would be more expensive, really. 4 horses could certainly share the load, and yes, they would get you there faster because the strain of going at speed for any length of time would be shared between the 4 animals, but when you think that you've got to stop and feed them and rest them every so many miles, or you've got to swap horses, it's actually going to get to the point where you're paying twice as much for a chaise and four to get you from A to B than a chaise and two would. It's a bit like driving at 60 miles an hour is going to get you to your destination twice as fast as if you were driving at 30 miles an hour, but it's also going to be using an awful lot more fuel in your car. Lady Catherine comes down to Longbourn in her chaise and four. We can sort of infer that she is flaunting her wealth a bit more than she needs to there, perhaps, but in her mind speed is clearly of the essence. But let's reflect on the Bennets. Out of the 5 Bennet sisters, Jane, Lizzie, Mary and Kitty are all aged 17 or older. So today all of them would be old enough to have at least a provisional driving licence, and the chances are that the older ones, and probably Mary too because she's a studious type, I think she'd be able to concentrate and apply herself, would have studied the driving theory, and they'd have probably had enough lessons to pass the test, particularly Jane because she's 22, so chances are she'd have been driving about 5 years. So I can sort of understand why, although she herself would not actually be in charge of the horses, when Jane gets invited to dinner with the Bingley sisters, she turns to her father and she says, "Can I have the carriage?" After all, she's 22. She doesn't want to live from her parents, and going by carriage is almost certainly going to get her there looking neater and tidier than if she goes on horseback. But Mrs. Bennet gets her husband to admit that most of their horses are needed on the farm, which is telling us that Mr. Bennet must have some land next to or near Longbourn that is used for agriculture. And he's probably getting quite a bit of income from his surplus produce being sold, that kind of thing. He would be making his land earn him money, that's how it worked. So probably the horses are being used for ploughing. There was no mechanised alternative really at that time. So poor Jane has to go to dinner on a single horse in the rain. You can imagine how embarrassed she must have felt turning up to see her new and very fashionable friends, dripping wet and looking quite bedraggled, because she's just gone 3 miles on a horse in the rain. And smelling of wet horse too, probably. Interestingly, when Mr. and Mrs. Bennet find out that Elizabeth wants to marry Darcy at the end of the novel, they both mention carriages. If the Bennet's carriage is only free for pleasure trips when the horses aren't needed to work on the land, this really explains why Mrs. Bennet is so excited about Elizabeth having access to multiple carriages, and why Mr. Bennet comments, "He's rich to be sure, and you may have more fine carriages and clothes than Jane." In modern terms, what they're saying is, you lucky girl, you're marrying a man who can afford to provide you with your own car when you've only been able to share one with your sisters until now. Elizabeth, from that perspective, and Jane too, are certainly going up in the world. So now that we've explored the details of Darcy's family history and we have sketched a rough picture of how wealthy he is just by investigating what Jane Austen tells us about the vehicle he drives, can we do the obvious thing? Can we draw his family tree? To say that Darcy is a bit mysterious as a character, there is a surprising amount of information about his ancestry. Lady Catherine describes the link between Darcy and her daughter Anne. She also describes how her plans for her daughter Anne to marry Darcy date back to when they were in their cradles. So there is probably no more than 3 years difference in age between Anne and Darcy. Darcy's about 28, so I'd guess Anne is somewhere between 25 and 31. Lady Catherine, of course, is Mr. Darcy's aunt. Formally, we know that she is addressed as the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh. If she was married to a knight, she would just be plain Lady de Bourgh. Because she is an earl's daughter, she is allowed to call herself Lady Catherine. She's allowed to include her forename in that full title. And that is why she emphasises, I think, that her niece Georgiana is the daughter of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley and Lady Anne. Darcy's housekeeper just refers to her late mistress as Mrs. Darcy, and it's possible that she probably did prefer to be known as Mrs. Darcy. Formally, she would be Lady Anne Darcy after marriage, although her husband would just be referred to as Mr. Darcy. He can't inherit his wife's title, it doesn't work like that. The Darcys are gentry, but as Lady Catherine says, they don't have a title. Lady Catherine's late husband, Sir Lewis de Bourgh, could have been a baronet or a knight. That's what Sir is suggesting to me. Baronet is a hereditary title, a knighthood isn't, and it isn't entirely clear whether when Lady Catherine dies, Anne, her daughter, is going to become Lady Anne de Bourgh, or if she's just going to be Miss, or Mrs. if she happens to have actually married by then. Sir Lewis would have been addressed as Sir Lewis in conversation, but never as Sir de Bourgh. In the same way, Sir William Lucas, who was a tradesman and then a mayor before he was knighted, Sir William would always be addressed as Sir William, never as Sir Lucas. That, again, it doesn't work like that. In the wider Fitzwilliam / Darcy family tree, we also know that Lady Catherine has a nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, Darcy's cousin, which again is suggesting that somehow they are all connected on Darcy's mother's side. So when Elizabeth and Colonel Fitzwilliam have a light-hearted conversation about the fact that both of them need to marry for money, Elizabeth comments, "And pray, what is the usual price of an earl's younger son?" So Colonel Fitzwilliam's father is an earl. When Darcy writes to Elizabeth telling all about Wickham, we also learn that his first name is Fitzwilliam. And it isn't all that unusual for a son to be given his mother's maiden name as a forename. Sometimes you get it put in as middle name, but you often get it put in as a forename. Whether or not it is suitable, surnames do actually tend to work quite well as male forenames, not so much female, but certainly male. After all, we know that Anderberg and Darcy are cousins because their mothers were sisters, which is making quite a good case for Darcy's mother, Lady Catherine, and Colonel Fitzwilliam's father, the Earl of Unknown, to have been one group of siblings. So without even having to know the exact birth order, we don't know whether Colonel Fitzwilliam's dad was the only son in the family or whether he was the eldest of 10 brothers. It doesn't really matter. We can still construct a family tree for Darcy's maternal ancestors, and I think it would look a little bit like this. When she realises that Darcy is interested in Elizabeth, and she notices this quite early on, probably because she wants him for herself, Caroline Bingley makes a catty remark about how when Darcy marries Elizabeth, he must have a portrait of her uncle, Mr. Phillips, painted and installed in the gallery at Pemberley, next to the one of his own great uncle, who was a judge. Miss Bingley's reasoning for this? Well, Mr. Phillips is an attorney, a lawyer, and this nameless great uncle was a judge. So her logic is, well, they're both in the same line of work, in a very, very loose sense. She's being sarcastic. It isn't stated which side of Darcy's family this great uncle comes from. No surname is mentioned. But if his portrait is in the gallery at Pemberley, which is the family's ancestral home, which seems to have been their ancestral home for a good 200 years and probably more, it does seem to suggest that this great uncle was a brother, probably a younger brother, because the eldest brother would inherit the property and would be busy enough managing it and basically living the life of a gentleman and would not have to work in the sense that we understand it today. So he's probably a younger brother of Darcy's grandfather, or maybe he married a sister of Darcy's grandfather. For simplicity's sake, and also I think it's probably a bit more plausible on balance, I'm going to imagine that this great uncle was a Darcy by birth, because it just makes more sense that that's why his portrait would be hanging in the gallery. Obviously a highly esteemed, successful in his career, and must have been very highly respected, a hard-working legal person. Otherwise, I think if he was somebody with a bit of a shady past, somebody who might have been a bit underhand in his work, I think the family would have quietly put his portrait in a room that nobody went in. They wouldn't have it in the gallery where visitors, as we can clearly see from the novel, because Elizabeth and the gardeners just do exactly that, where the visitors are allowed public access to the house and where they will see the portrait of this nameless judge. So using that little bit of information, now we can construct something of a Darcy family tree. And again, I think this is what Darcy's paternal ancestry, as far as it can be sketched from the novel's details, would have looked like. But the great thing about literature is that it's always open to interpretation. If it wasn't, everybody would have said everything they wanted to say about Pride and Prejudice when it was first published, and there would be nothing left to say. But the beauty of Jane Austen, I think, is that you can pull out so many interesting bits from her novels, otherwise I would never have come up with this series in the first place. So if you have ever sat down and tried to construct any or all of the family trees that I've looked at in this series of videos, I'd really like to know whether you agree with the information in my drawings. Do you think I have got the relationships right? Do you think there is another interpretation for how some of these characters, seen and unseen, are linked to each other? Either way, I would love to know how you would construct a family tree for any of the families in Pride and Prejudice. If you've got any suggestions, please leave them in the comments, and I will see what I think when I read them. I'm looking forward to seeing your theory. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed this slightly unusual take on a novel that has been around for a long, long time and has been enjoyed by many people, and doubtless will be enjoyed by many more.